everybody. I'm Martha Menino. I'm the dean at Harvard Law School, and I love this turnout. And I love the responsiveness of the organizers who immediately found a way to open up the room and double the size, because this is the responsive city. I am absolutely ecstatic to see the joining together of the communities of people interested in public service and the people interested in big data. And it's all because of the insights and genius of Susan Crawford. This event is co-sponsored by the Harvard Law School Library and by the Berkman Center. And it reflects, I think, imagination of just the sort we need to tackle big problems. And so with great delight, I turn to my colleague, Jonathan Zittrain, who is both the director of the library and professor, not only at the law school, but at the Kennedy School and at the School of Engineering. Jonathan Zittrain.
Thank you, Dean Menino, and welcome everybody. It's just great to see truly all of you here today. We're going to have Susan open up with some comments about her fantastic book. There are a number of blurbs on it that you can see should you buy or borrow the book. I think that Susan was sort of saying if she could blurb her own book, it would be, how did you say, a number of very interesting stories. It has some of the attractiveness of People magazine.
People magazine of the civic tech movement.
The People magazine of the civic tech movement. That is a great blurb for your book, with the depth of Scientific American. Exactly. So yes, exactly. And then we have some panelists who will react to what Susan has to say. And this has been a fast evolving set of panelists. Mitchell Weiss is with Mayor Menino, who is not well and in the hospital. And Mayor Curtatone is actually in the hospital, but nothing terrible. And his chief of staff, Daniel Hadley, has agreed to play the part of Mayor Curtatone in today's performance. And then we'll open it up for broader discussion among everybody here. So Susan, welcome. Thank you for writing this book and for sharing it with us today. Let me also just thank the folks at the Harvard Law School Library, including June Casey, and at the Berkman Center, including Carrie Anderson, for pulling all of this together, and for our good folks at Media Services and Room Services for adapting so quickly to changing circumstance.
Thank you.
Susan, over to you.
Thank you all.
I couldn't be happier to be here. I really couldn't. I went to a small, non-elite law school to the south, as Chief Justice Roberts would refer to it. And our 25th reunion was this past weekend. And a 25th reunion gives you an opportunity to reflect on just what happened over your career. And I was very fortunate to bump into a very large idea as I graduated from law school, one that's very familiar to all of you. And that's the idea of the internet, that we can communicate with anybody at a distance. I'd come from a very quiet household, and I was a very shy young woman. And I was fortunate to be told about this idea of community involvement and engagement and participation in sort of bubbly, almost musical interaction across the world through technology. And then over the last 25 years, I think I've been descaling. I started off at the international level, thinking about the plumbing of the internet, the domain names and IP addresses that make the whole thing function so we have one globally interoperable internet. And I was fortunate enough to serve on the ICANN board for 3 years and really 10 years of being a camp follower of ICANN, which is a place of some dehydration and despair. It's hard to make things happen at the international level. You know, there are lots of acronyms and you're doing your best, and I was very earnest about it, but difficult to make a lot of change. And then I was fortunate in the middle of my career to spend time at the federal level on the White House staff. That was interesting. So there, I was very focused on widespread internet infrastructure for America and the difficulties that we have getting everybody online at a reasonable price, wanting that dream of internet access for everyone. And I encountered quite a corrosive and polarized setting. I was surprised by that. I was very idealistic, looking for cheerful ebullience wherever I go. And it wasn't quite there at the federal level, but now I think I've arrived, because cities, in this process of descaling, cities are where democracy still works, where you can feel the effect of your actions daily as a government employee. There is no better place to work at the intersection of technology and policy and helping people, really, than local government. And this book, The Responsive City, looks at wonderful stories across America, across the world, of people doing their best, often against impossible odds, to make life better for citizens using technology. Doing democracy better is actually the point of all of this, making it possible for citizens to feel a sense of autonomy and agency when they interact with their government, making it possible for governments to function much more effectively and efficiently using data. You may think this is surprising, but governments were built with transactional systems that were going to do Project X and not necessarily prepared to use data to collaborate across the walls of the silos of their departments. So it's hard to see this, but right now, this beautiful October day in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we're at a transformative moment for local government using technology. Huge innovations all across the globe with many layered interactions with citizens, starting with fiber at the bottom of it, open, unlimited capacity communications so that everyone can be in touch with an interactive way with what's going on in their local government, moving on to sensors and infrastructure that are collecting vast reams of data that can then be visualized and understood, algorithms that are chewing through all that data and spitting out predictions of the future, and finally screens everywhere, making visible what we had in the past just imagined to be true. So 3 big developments are driving these innovations. One is handsets that are now in almost everybody's hands across the world, particularly in cities. Most people are moving into cities, and most people in those cities have those handsets. Much faster processing so that we can chew through data in ways we never could have imagined, even 10 years ago. And personnel, finally, inside local government who are comfortable with both technology and policy. These are all new developments in the last few years. Against those great developments are tremendous obstacles. The status quo has tremendous appeal in local government as at the other levels from which I've been descaling. A lack of enterprise worldview is often a problem. A city government may not think of itself as a single enterprise, but rather a series of fiefdoms kind of battling it out. And clarity of purpose, knowing what you're trying to accomplish, what outcomes are needed from the city is also sometimes a big obstacle to progress. So let me tell you 3 stories about people who are against these odds, making tremendous progress. One of my favorite cities in the world is Chicago, and Chicago plays a central role in the responsive city. There, a fearless leader, Rahm Emanuel, hired people immediately into his administration who were great data scientists and technologists who were fearless. They didn't know that government wasn't supposed to work, and they just took it on. Open data was one of the first steps they took. But then they saw the city as a platform, trying to use their legacy transaction systems and layer above them data analytics that would allow them to predict what might happen next. Here's a very simple story told in the book. Chicago's sitting on a lake, right? Lots of water and lots of rats. Now, rats have no constituency, so they're not going to complain about what you do to go after them. And the city figured out that by chewing through its 311 data, all the complaints coming into the city about what was going on, they could predict, based on just a few leading indicators, where rats were about to occur. So, I'm sorry, this is lunchtime, maybe I shouldn't be talking about rats, but when the birds were dying in a particular area, a lot of dead birds, trash overflowing, not being collected, in a few days you could predict that rats would appear. And the sanitation department had never in the past focused its resources using data on where to investigate and where to put rat poison. For the first time, using 311 data, Chicago was able to make that prediction, say, put the bait there, go after the rats. They were extraordinarily successful, inductively looking for clues in data the city already had. Because often a city doesn't know what it knows. It just lurches forward, and Chicago was unwilling to do that. They drew a lot of their data together into a much faster processing environment, and the RAT pilot is just the first of many that will now use correlated databases to make predictions about where resources should be directed for restaurant inspections, for where infrastructure might break down in the city of Chicago, for opportunities to address environmental conditions. We're just at the beginning of this, and Chicago is really leading the way. They're also mapping all of this data to something they call the Windy Grid interface. You can ask that interface a question. Tell me the story of 35 Harrow Street. And then all the city data associated with that address can be shown to you in a time series or as a multi-layered visualization, never possible in the past. Separate departments never talking to each other, separated by fiefdoms and tribes of lack of cooperation. So inductively looking for correlations, looking for visual interfaces that hadn't existed, and running fiber beneath the streets of Chicago in these old channels that had been used for coal in the days of Chicago's great infrastructure manufacturing time. Now fiber will be there, linking all these neighborhoods of Chicago and making it possible for visualized data to be visible to every neighborhood. A brand new step, never happened before, and only with the leadership of Mayor Emanuel is all this possible. Chicago is actually planning a new part of its city. The old U.S. Steel plant is now vacant. It's been vacant for decades, and they're building new infrastructure and city buildings there now, and a new neighborhood, using environmental information, transportation information, data swirling together for architects and urban planners. Never before attempted. So Chicago is an inspiring story of both leadership and personnel and bravery in the face of difficult circumstances. They also have an intermediary there, Smart Chicago, funded by philanthropic enterprises, that gets in the middle between citizens and the city government to help explain what new applications the city is developing, make them more visible to neighborhood residents, and serve as a kind of beta tester for concerns about privacy and surveillance, so that none of the policy questions are left off the table. We have an opportunity in Chicago to revisit all the questions of data and fiber and a thriving civic tech community building a wonderful ecosystem there. Another story after Chicago is the story of a tiny town in Spain called June, J-U-N. In June, every single policeman has a Twitter handle on his uniform. And the mayor tweets constantly at people, asking them questions. This is a tiny town, but you can imagine what might happen next. Asking questions about how the city is doing. When you want to schedule a health appointment or book a conference room in City Hall, you use Twitter and a direct message to reach that resource, and the conference room swings open in response to your direct message. Twitter in the middle between citizens and city resources is an extraordinarily interesting development. We don't know yet what effect that'll have on social welfare. We imagine that the civic mesh of goods will become richer as people feel a sense of autonomy, agency, engagement with the city not possible before. The whole point here is to increase the number of touch points between the city and the citizen, so we get rid of this sterile relationship. You pay taxes, I provide services, and instead have a much richer and more human interaction between cities and their citizens. A third story, and in honor of Mayor Menino, Boston. Menino met half the people in Boston while he was in office, shook their hands personally, and was known for his friendliness and engagement with the people of the city. Not a tech guy, not at all. And he was enthusiastic about using technology to reach even more people in Boston. And with his team launched something called Citizens Connect, the very first 311 app for a phone that allows people to reach the city with a picture of something in the city that's bothering them and get an immediate sense of the response to that. Menino and his team over years built this capacity to respond, to be full of an ability to connect that had not been present before in a very brutal city hall. It's almost impossible to collaborate there. And when Bill Oates, the past CIO, arrived in City Hall, he heard the sound of typewriters in 2006. 2006, typewriters, Boston City Hall. So a lot to do to change that system. And Menino's personality and sense of urgency about connecting with citizens turned out to galvanize his entire tech team to use technology in the service of citizen engagement. Citizens Connect is the first story there. We're very lucky to be graced today by the presence of Jascha Franklin-Hodge, who's the current Chief Information Officer of Boston, who will have lots of stories about what Boston's doing next to connect with people. Finally, the story of Mike Flowers in New York City is told in The Responsive City. Mike had served in Iraq as an intelligence officer and thought when he came back to New York City as a predictive analytics person, he thought of the New York City government as a series of tribes that were refusing to work with each other and that would refuse to share data. He wanted to use data to predict the solution to business problems the city was having. So he went around with his thumb drive to different agencies, asking them to contribute their data to his database, and was able to put together several disparate forms of data to, for example, solve the following problem. There was a terrible fire in New York that killed 5 kids and several young adults, and the housing department had not inspected that building recently for fire. So the city knew it had to do something quickly to understand the reasons for inspecting buildings in a particular order, rather than just doing it randomly, not enough inspectors. Why can't we target how we do that better? Mike determined, based on foreclosure information, information about renovation, information about complaints from the building, many different databases tied together, he figured out that with just a few key leading factors, you could determine where illegal conversions were taking place and where a fire was likely to occur. With that information, armed with that, the housing inspectors could then target their investigations, go to places that were in more danger of being set on fire because of conversions, and save lives. Very simple. And Mike's very flat about this. He says, of course we save lives. Going from irrational to rational is going to provide better solutions. Mike is a cocky, abrasive, break the glass kind of guy. And he's in the book as an example of a new kind of civil servant empowered by technology to act with more discretion, to understand the context of what they're working on, to see a problem and act on it using data. So we've got the leadership example of Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, the systemic example of Chicago as a platform, the use of technology in Boston to encourage citizen engagement, not to put a wall between citizens and government, but to encourage outreach. Boston stands for that in the book. And Mike Flowers stands for the empowered, newly empowered public employee. And I'm hoping that all of you here who are students will consider serving in local government at some point in your lives. Because remember my story of descaling. I started at the international level, I've come to cities, I now believe that cities are where the action is. Because when cities do many small things well using technology, serve people, demonstrate the role of government in people's lives, they can then take on the big things that are needed to solve human problems in America. We've got growing inequality, enormous problems with global warming, economic dislocation right and left, needs for new kinds of jobs, new ways for making a living. This interface between technology and local government is going to provide us with a rich distillation of information, engagement, outreach that will help cities solve these big things eventually. Because just as the small, for me, now echoes the reasons I got interested in the big, so too, doing the small in a city and doing it extremely well using technology makes possible the big ideas about democracy that are the reasons that we all went to law school in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Crawford. Maybe we can ask Daniel Hadley and Jascha Franklin-Hodge to come up. And I trust that once you're seated, the Klieg light won't be in your eye from the placard. Yeah, good, very good. Daniel, why don't we start with you? I know you've prepared extensive remarks to respond. So I'm thinking actually it might just be good to have a quick dialogue here. So Daniel, tell us about your background.
Great. So thanks. It's good to be here. I wish the data had been a little bit bigger. I might have been able to predict that the mayor would be in the hospital today and prepared for this event. My background is I actually graduated from the School of Design in urban planning, and I'm pleased to see this conversation, where I think it's sort of affecting all schools in Harvard, every bathtub on its bottom, but it seems to have infected everyone, this conversation about big data and governance. So I'm really excited about that because it had started really when I was still a student there, and it seems to have extended well beyond the walls of each school. So that's exciting.
And would you describe yourself as like a data wonk?
Yes, yeah, through and through. I'm a pure data geek, and I think that's why the mayor.
And just tell us quickly, what does a data geek comprise? Yeah. What does that mean? What do I do if I want to become a data geek? What degree do I get? What book do I read?
Right. So I mean, you'll know it when you are a data geek and you're up at 4 o'clock in the morning.
You're not one yet.
And when you're up in 4 in the morning doing coding in R or Python, and you finally get to the visualization, and you're so excited that you stay up for another 2 hours until the sun comes up, still coding further. But I think there's a data geek in all of us. I think that
this is going to be a tough sell, I think.
Look inside of yourselves, but I think it's in there, and I think the mayor is great proof of that. He started as a lawyer, like many of you, and he got excited about the data, really internalized the concepts about the data, and because of books like The Responsive City and all the exciting hype around it, and seeing the success of other communities, he's just been so excited about data and its potential.
So let me ask you for one example. It doesn't have to be the best and biggest, but one example of a way in which you really, after staying up all night or seeing the way that data worked, you were like, wow. This is the 21st century, hallelujah. And then correspondingly, an example that may have gone somewhat awry.
Great, good question. So one good example is, I think we've all been able to take from these examples that Susan writes about in the book. And for instance, we've also done some predictive analytics on where our rodents would be. And as a result, we've been able to actually, to decrease the problem somewhat. We've been able to actually have an impact there because we've been able to predict where they will be, and then as a result be able to go into the places where we predict they will be and change the kind of conditions that allows rodents to thrive. So if you're a Somerville resident,
this is like Minority Report for rodents.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. We know where they'll be before they know.
Before the rodents can even commit their crimes.
Exactly. And we're not so, once they're guilty, they're gone.
The rough justice of Somerville.
Exactly. Mean streets of Somerville. But for those of you who are residents and residents of Cambridge and Boston, I would say, because the problem is regional, that I think is a big win. A problem is, I would say it's when your data you think is excellent, you get in there, you do a visualization, you take it to, say, the police department, and you show them, I think I've got some great intel for you. I think I've analyzed this data. And they come back and they say, right, except for the big asterisk by the data. We didn't tell you that the way this was coded was all wrong. And I've had this happen where I was doing an analysis on shots fired, and they come back and say, well, yeah, but the false positive is so high that you could never really use that as great intel, because every time a firecracker goes off or a car backfires, you see the problem there. So that's one. And one other kind of problem you face frequently is small data, big challenges. Right? So right now, one of our biggest problems is opiate abuse in the city. And we have people who are struggling. We've seen more overdose deaths than we have in the last 5 years combined. It's a huge problem for which there's small data, N equals 10. And the people who are affected by it, there's not a whole lot of records. If they are, they're in 15 different places. So that's where I think we're seeing some of the biggest challenges.
aside from the question of, do cars still backfire? That seems like kind of a Jughead sort of 1950s thing, but I take your point. How do you decide the locus of analytics? To the extent that you're really into big data, how much are you thinking, because much of Professor Crawford's book is about let the public clean up this bad data. There's these maps in New York City of bad, of these vacant lots and such, but often there's surveyors' errors. How much is both the grooming of the data and the analytics upon it properly taking place out in the world by anybody who wants to do it versus something that you might have happening within the city departments?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, Susan mentioned the three pillars, and I would just add one, which is open source. You know, this is something that's really revolutionized how we do things. And, you know, in Somerville, we have a lot of hackers, coders, data geeks, and I've actually used some of their data. There's some of their own analysis, some scripts they've used to scrape our own website. You know, surprisingly, I could use their script before I would go in and grab the data off the server. So in some ways, it's just the open source community has allowed us to share and collaborate so thoroughly, which we couldn't have done 5 years ago even. But, you know, and I've been able to take examples from Susan's book, read about them, go find the code, apply it to our data, have that, you know, do all the munging and cleaning and scraping, and then be able to analyze it on my own. But so I would just say the open source community has really added a new dimension to it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. Jascha, over to you. Yeah. You're the CIO of the City of Boston, Chief Information Officer.
Correct.
And you also run a firm, is that right?
No longer. I was formerly with a company called Blue State Digital, but I left that job to take on the role with the City of Boston.
And are you a data geek?
Yes, I'm definitely a data geek.
Boy,
I think
people who are data geeks really know it. There's not a hesitation there.
Well, I think, you know, anybody who is interested in public policy should be a data geek, because ultimately the goal of trying to work in a city, the goal of policy, the goal of programs is to have impacts. And anecdote is one way to sort of learn about the impacts that you're having, but ultimately,
the bad way, it sounds like.
More often than not, you know, there are certainly problems that are sort of small data problems for which that's often the only way. But I think when you look at the scale of a city, even a city of the size of Boston, really thinking about how are you measuring those impacts? How are you measuring the outcomes that your policy is intended to achieve? That requires you to be a data geek. It requires everybody who's involved in public policy to care about and be interested in data and interested in understanding how do you translate the idea of this intervention will have this outcome to actual measurement of success.
And I guess that gets a little bit to Professor Crawford's point that too often in government, traditionally, we measure when we measure activity rather than impact. How many forms did you fill out today would be the caricature of that. If indeed we shift to an emphasis on impact and less on an emphasis of documenting exactly how municipal workers go about their jobs, Professor Crawford also points out how that can be dodgy. There might be a reason why we have the formula that people are to follow, including, you know, from 100 years ago, corruption, if they're not sort of monitored. How do you balance among those things, or is it just so needed to go to impact right now that there's not a risk of somehow overdoing it?
Well, you know, I think some of the balancing is done for you by statutory requirements and process that is, you know, will take decades to unwind in terms of legal requirements for what we do, what we can and can't do.
This is a way of saying, don't worry, there's so much law that we can't stand that isn't going anywhere that you've still got your activity.
More or less, but I think that the you know, the idea of shifting to impact measurement or to rebalancing a little bit in that direction, you know, is rooted in a fundamental. You know, you can look at these laws, you can look at these requirements. This is how this process will be done. If you want to get this permit, these are the standards you must meet. And there is a reason behind almost all of those things. But many of those reasons aren't necessarily still relevant or aren't necessarily still important. You know, you look at, I learned last week that the Parks Department has to sign off on street closures in the city of Boston if you want to have a special event. They don't know why. They don't want to do it. But it's this step. step that
They
has
can't
to...
just put a sign on their office that says yes.
Yeah, right. I should suggest
Fine
that.
by us.
I should suggest that. So for us, what we're trying to do is take that step back and think about the big picture of all the pieces that go into outcomes. In the case of having a special event, how long does it take a citizen to go from idea to permit in hand? And looking at each step along the way, looking at where the time goes, looking at how much work they have to do, looking at how many offices they have to visit, how long the lines are that they have to wait in, and trying to figure out how we can optimize this. Because ultimately the impact for us is how easy is it for people to do things in the city that we want to encourage them to do. There are legitimate public policy objectives along the way. You can't just decide I'm going to close down Beacon Street and put up a sign and start having a party. But within the realm of meeting our legitimate public policy objectives, our goal needs to be to make it as easy as possible. And that's sort of where I think by putting that outcome frame around all of the conversations of process, of policy, of law, it allows us to reopen some questions that perhaps haven't been asked in 50, 60 years when the laws were originally created.
So that sounds like difficult but extremely satisfying work when you can make it happen, and kind of win-win for everybody. There's few people, even the Parks Department is like willing to give up quite literally its turf here, it seems.
Right. That's a rarity, but
but back to the open source question of, to the extent that there may now be new data on impact that the city gathers and can release, but that might embarrass the city in the short term. It might be data that, Medford doesn't say how many potholes they have, but if we go public with it, it's all over the globe. Or I know the ACLU has been in an interesting relationship with the Boston Police Department over racial disparities in stops and frisks, things like that. How do you think through the idea of, in principle, it's great to release, but at a given moment, there may really be some backlash. As soon as you show a vulnerability, which is part of the way of getting it fixed, if the vulnerability is at the feet of the city, how do you make it so that the city at that moment feels comfortable taking the hit and releasing the data?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we've been, Boston has done a very good job of looking at it from a big picture perspective. And certainly Mayor Walsh has come into office saying, look, we are not just going to continue to do things the way we have always done them, and we need to ask hard questions. And sometimes those questions shine an uncomfortable spotlight on the city, on how we operate. I think right now we have the benefit of being a relatively new administration, and so not having
our fault.
Full ownership of
time to air out all the laundry before it's yours.
So I think that there's an element of that, but part of the strategy in this is to say, if we can air the laundry, if we can sort of show this is the reality on the ground today, and we can set targets for ourselves, and we can really say, one of the first things the mayor did when he came into office was to audit the whole process of getting a building permit. How long does it take to get a permit approved if there's no zoning variance needed? And when we looked at this, we're seeing permit approval times that are measured in months. Now, you think about a city with an affordable housing crisis, you think about this sort of moment of economic opportunity that we're in right now, and that time has real cost in dollars, in prosperity for the city of Boston. And so he set after doing this audit and after understanding where the embarrassment was, made the data public and set some very specific targets. And my department has been held in working very closely with inspectional services to try to build the systems that will allow us to measure to those outcome-based targets and to say, okay, we are going to try to get 70% of long-form permits approved in 20 days or less. And we're very close to that target now after months of very deliberate work and using data, using analysis at every level, both the big picture, how are we performing, but also we have a 30-page document that shows each individual inspector's performance relative to their historical performance, relative to the mean of the city, and that's become an invaluable management tool. So I think we have to own these challenges. If we're serious about fixing things, we have to be willing to recognize when we're not doing it right. Sometimes what happens when we release this data, and I think the police ACLU conversation that's been happening is a good example of this, what you see is an actual public policy debate happening. Because what happens is there there's different views. Data is not intrinsically, it doesn't intrinsically tell a story. It needs interpretation, and there are decisions and policies that sit behind all of those data that sometimes need to be evaluated. There needs to be a conversation. I think we're seeing that take place right now around the ACLU issues.
So it's a helpful hands tying exercise or holding of the feet to the fire when it starts to get hot. I'm curious, maybe for both of you, would you be supportive if the governor or the legislature asks whether to have either a kind of Freedom of Information Act or even one step further, a compelled release of data after being scrubbed for the usual things such as citizen privacy and stuff, that it's just what you must do rather than that you can choose to do? The default should be you must release it.
We would be thrilled. The mayor signed an open data executive order that actually mandates exactly that for the city of Boston.
And we've almost finished ours, so I think we're in the same boat. We would definitely be thrilled with that. Yeah.
And it turns out that open data is extraordinarily useful for people inside city government, because now they don't have to pick up the phone and have a friend named Keith that knows where the data is. It's actually there. So the open data movement turns out to really help government effectiveness.
Wonderful. We have 10 minutes left because we got a late start, and we're going to still have a hard close because a number of students have classes just after 1 and such. Consider the floor open, realizing we have 10 minutes left, so brevity is the soul of wit. Yes, sir. Feel free to tell us who you are so we can gather data.
I know.
Is it not on? Hold on a second here. We will not let technology be the end of us. Okay.
My name's Dave Heckman. I'm a 1L here at HLS. My question is sort of, once you have all this data, and it's wonderful that, you know, with open source and all that, once we have it, sort of motivating people to do useful things with it. So there's been sort of a lot of ways that has happened. Professor Crawford, you talked about, you know, sort of a lot of internal things happening from within the city government. There's also, you know, places where it's been outside, either app developers or whoever using it, or sort of a partnership between the two, or contests, be it, you know, DARPA or whoever that's running these things. Could you kind of speak to what is maybe the most useful or kind of has been the most effective way to sort of motivate actual productive use of this data once we've got it?
We only make progress when we can see something. And being able to visualize data and reveal surprising patterns and have a group of people who don't agree with each other look at a shared screen, emotions go down with visualized data. You know, Jascha's right, you have to figure out what the presumptions are behind the data. But we can make tremendous progress on extraordinarily difficult issues by looking at a shared screen of visualized compared data. I know that sounds too simple, but it's a huge advance. It's almost as if there's an electronic layer over everything. Things once invisible become visible. So there's lots of progress being made on issues from everything, like where's the flood going to be? How can I protect myself? What neighborhoods really need attention? Where's obesity really a problem? And what could we do to increase walking space, you know, in a neighborhood to lower the rates of obesity? Bringing disparate groups together in front of a shared screen is the big impact of all this.
I would just add to that quickly. I think there's a real challenge within the open data world around how to make the data useful. One of the things that's been missing is the sort of concept of librarianship for data. When we just throw data sets out on the web and say, okay, we're open. Trying to build the curation layer, the structure that allows people to understand the data sets, to relate them to each other. I would love to be able to compare Somerville data and Boston data. Right. That has been one of the gaps, I think, in the open data movement. It's something that we're trying to catalyze a shift on in Boston, and I know at the Commonwealth level they're trying to bring multiple city open data sets together in a shared environment to help make it more useful to people who might be consumers.
Sounds almost Wolfram Alpha-esque, this idea of a computational knowledge engine, where you can ask Wolfram Alpha to graph the number of dentists per capita in Somerville versus New Delhi over time.
Well, actually, my hometown of Santa Monica is developing a well-being index that will allow cities to look at each other comparatively for outcomes, exactly what Jascha was talking about. So it's a Wolfram for well-being.
Yeah, I love the smackdown of we're more being than you are.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What do you see as the greatest challenge to improved city governance through data?
What do you guys see?
The greatest challenges to improve city government through data. I mean, Again, I think it's when the data is incomplete, or when it can't be applied specifically to your greatest challenges. Like when I say, our greatest challenge in terms of, loss of life this year will be the opiate epidemic, and we can't really bring data to bear on that. But other than that, and this goes back to a response to your question too. I think the greatest opportunity is when we see other people doing it well, and that's why I picked up a copy of the book very early on, and I read other people's blogs voraciously, because you can see where other people have had success and apply that in your city.
So I would say all of those are challenges, but the biggest challenge of using data in city government is, I think, one of the biggest challenges in government that dates back prior to big data, and that is, how do we manage? How do we allow organizations of thousands, in many cases thousands or tens of thousands of people, to produce good outcomes for their citizens? Data is a tool. It does not solve anything by itself. And it's only a useful tool when we're able to bring it to bear in the context of a management environment that enables people to focus on these outcomes, to focus on performance, to focus on the lives of citizens. Producing the report of inspector performance for ISD was easy compared to the weekly meetings that we and others sit in with the inspection team to go over that data and try to use it to change performance. But I am a huge believer that once you bring this data in, and once you have executive leadership that understands where the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve, that suddenly you have empowered thoughtful, engaged managers to lead in a whole new kind of way within government. So that challenge is, I think, the biggest thing we have today.
You may have noticed the front three tables were reserved. We have visiting friends from the United Kingdom, kind of the Boston to the Somerville of America. So we wanted to greet you, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I'm Chris Zittrain. I'm also an HKS alum, so I feel very at home here. And thank you, Professor Crawford, for letting us join you. So this is a group of public leaders, city leaders, leaders in health, and in other environments as well. And I think the question that I had was, given your research, given the international perspective, is a city a city? And pretty much the same wherever you look in terms of the data, in terms of the use of data, or are there significant differences which come with culture and the different legal systems and so on?
That's a wonderful question. There is a difference, and leadership is the secret sauce in a lot of this. Because, as Jascha described, there are often silos of activity and just turf battles that are going on with very well-meaning public servants not being willing to collaborate with each other because they can't see the overall benefit, and there's no incentive for them to do so. So cities where there's a leader who understands deeply the role of technology in the future and sees that technology is just not a ministerial add-on, it's part of policymaking. It makes possible change in a city. Where those elements are in place, leadership plus an empowered group of public employees, enormous things happen. With not that much investment, by the way, in fancy systems from Oracle or Siemens and IBM, that you can do a lot using open source software and using your resources inside the city to bring about enormous change. So no, cities are quite different. They're learning from each other, but some are racing ahead, the benefit of real leadership.
Susan, in your gathering of anecdote and data about different cities struggling with this, do you find that in the leadership mode, having a strong mayoral, strong executive format makes it easier for a city to just be like, this is the direction we're going, versus, say, a city council with a mayor as figurehead? I was trying to figure out whether to invoke Rob Ford and decided not to. Sort of decided not to, I guess.
Couldn't hold yourself back.
And the other question is unions. Discuss.
Jascha, you want to talk about unions?
I'm not going to talk about unions. I mean, I think, what I will say is there are definitely big differences in the workforce between public sector and the private sector. But what I've found in Boston, I'm relatively new in the position, I expected to go into a place where my biggest challenge was going to be convincing people that technology could help them, that it could make their lives better, it could help them do their jobs better. Instead, what I've found is a massive demand and an organization that I now lead, which is not quite yet ready to meet all of those demands. The reality is, whether you're a union employee or a non-union employee, public sector or private sector, almost everyone has a smartphone. They use technology. It has changed their lives in immeasurable ways, and their expectations are set by the technology in the world around them, by the experiences they have at home and in other contexts. And they demand that in their job. They demand good tools. They demand good user interfaces. They are interested in knowing how they can streamline the way that they work. I don't think it's a union or non-union issue, but I think the challenge for us in government is, how do we meet those expectations, both for our employees and for our citizens, all of whom have Facebook and Apple and Google to thank for this newfound view of what technology should do and the role it should play in their lives.
So I'll take the bait on the unions. I think we were recently able to let go of a very poorly performing employee who was part of a union, because we were able to show very clearly with the data that he was making up tickets, that he was making up work. And that was something we couldn't have done previously. Maybe you had a hunch, but you couldn't take it to the union president. So in some ways that helps. On the other hand, we also just had a couple of unions come together to block us putting in GPS units in our vehicles, which would give us really excellent data, help us optimize our snow plowing routes, do all kinds of wonderful things. So it's both challenge and a response to the challenge. And then to the first question on having a strong mayor, I think that definitely helps in the city of Somerville, where Joe meets with the analysts literally 4 times a week, first thing in the morning, hears their analytical reports, and is able to act on the data very quickly. So, yeah.
Susan, any thoughts on this question?
No, I just want to say how terrific it is that there's so many people here. I'm so touched at the interest, and I really think this is exciting. And because the responsive city is really about people. Cities are for people, and people still love their cities. There's great affection for it, and this idea of using technology to make everybody's life better, I find optimistic and inspiring and really quite exciting. So thank you very much for coming.
And whatever your view on quantiness, however data geeky you are, there is surely more data in the future that will be available than in the past. As we move to an Internet of Things, I keep wondering, will my Internet of Things shovel only speak to True Value Hardware Store where I got it? Or will it speak to other shovels, like, hi, how are you? Good to see you again. Or will it speak collectively to the city, so that you could imagine, even without the GPSs in the snowplows, sending the snowplows where it appears that people are doing the most shoveling, or sending the ambulances where they appear to be doing the most shoveling.
We'll know when you didn't shovel your walk and send you a ticket.
Or you haven't been doing your shoveling. Really, you can see, we could do an entire panel just about shovels. But I think we're all glad we didn't, and instead that we did this panel, and we owe Professor Crawford, Daniel Hadley, who stepped up truly at the 11th hour, and Jascha Franklin-Hodge, a huge thanks for sharing with us. Now I feel like this should be the end of a radio show. The book is The Responsive City, and it's available over at this table, where you can buy your own copy the old-fashioned way if you like. And I assume there's a Kindle edition too, but
Yes,
Susan can sign this copy. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks.